The ballroom of the Golden Nugget Casino in Las Vegas was filled to its maximum capacity on the evening of March 17, 1985. 5,000 people occupied every seat and lined the perimeter of the floor, their collective weight settling the air into a thickness that suggested the room itself was aware of what was about to unfold. The temperature had been set at 68 degrees by the hotel's climate control, but nobody inside felt cool. The stage was simple, a single spotlight from above, a wooden platform 8 inches high, and a microphone that stood at its edge, like a witness to a confession. Outside on the boulevard, traffic moved along Las Vegas Boulevard as it always did. The trucks carried cargo. The tourists walked toward the casinos, the world indifferent to the interior temperature of a ballroom 5 miles away. Jean-Claude Van Damme stood backstage in a white sleeveless shirt with the muscles of his shoulders and arms visible in a way that suggested he had spent the morning thinking about how those shoulders and arms would appear in this moment. He was 31 years old, 5 feet 11 inches tall, 192 pounds of muscle, distributed with the precision of a sculptor who had refused to leave anything to chance. He had spent his entire adolescence learning to execute a perfect spinning back kick. He had spent his 20s perfecting it, and he had spent the last 3 years transforming that skill into motion pictures that had made him a name that audiences remembered. He carried himself with the specific tension of a man who had worked longer than anyone else in the room, and believed that work should entitle him to a particular kind of recognition. 17 films. 17 times his face had appeared on a screen. 17 times audiences had watched him move in ways that reminded them of what human bodies were technically capable of achieving when directed by discipline and malice. And the 5 years before this evening, Chuck Norris had turned 60. He had done so quietly. No announcement, no birthday special filmed in advance for the cable networks. He had turned 60 the way a mountain weathers, by enduring. His hair had lightened toward silver. His face had deepened into the kind of structure that suggested not relaxation, but rather the absence of urgency. He was in the audience that evening, seated in the 4th row, wearing a denim jacket that had been purchased in 1979, and a white t-shirt beneath it, and a cap pulled low enough that the people in rows 1 through 3 had no reason to notice him. They did not notice him, nobody noticed him, and that was precisely the state he preferred. The specific silence of a ballroom 5 seconds before something irreversible occurs is not the same silence that precedes it. This silence contained knowledge. 5,000 people had gathered to watch martial artists demonstrate technique. They had come to see the celebrity exhibition that the Golden Nugget hosted once per year. The event where the rising names in action cinema gathered under one roof to remind audiences that they did not fake their own violence. Chuck Norris was not scheduled to appear. He had not planned to be there. A friend had invited him. He had accepted because he had nothing else scheduled for that evening, and because refusing invitations had begun to feel like a habit he should examine. And so he sat in the 4th row of the Golden Nugget Ballroom in March of 1985, wearing clothes from 6 years prior, watching Jean-Claude Van Damme prepare to demonstrate his flexibility and his kicks, and his increasingly famous charisma to an audience of 5,000 people who had paid money to confirm that what they saw in movie theaters was real. The master of ceremonies took the stage. He was a television personality who had agreed to host the event for a fee that had seemed reasonable in December and excessive by March. He welcomed the audience. He welcomed the participants. He recited statistics about each of the martial artists scheduled to demonstrate. When he reached Jean-Claude Van Damme, he paused. The master of ceremonies was not an idiot. He understood that a name could be said in a manner that elevated it, and he elevated this one. The master of ceremonies spoke of Van Damme's films. He spoke of the kicks. He spoke of something called flexibility that was said with a kind of reverence that suggested flexibility was a spiritual quality rather than a technical one. The audience responded as audiences do when they have been assembled to respond. They applauded. Jean-Claude Van Damme took the stage. He was wearing black pants and a black sleeveless shirt and black shoes that had been polished to a degree that suggested the shoes were also performing. He moved with a kind of precision that comes from knowing you are being watched, and choosing to make the watching worthwhile. He executed a series of kicks. His leg rose to his ear. It remained there. It rotated. His balance never wavered. The audience understood that what they were witnessing was not common. 5,000 people in a ballroom in Las Vegas on a March evening understood that their bodies could not do what they were watching. This understanding produced a particular kind of applause, not joyous, but acknowledging. The sound of people confirming the limits of their own possibility. The master of ceremonies returned to the stage. He was holding a microphone. He was smiling in the way that people smile when they have been given permission to say something they should not say. He asked Jean-Claude Van Damme if he wanted to challenge anyone in the audience. This was part of the script. The master of ceremonies asked this question every year. Occasionally someone took him up on it. Usually they regretted it. But the question was asked, and the master of ceremonies held the microphone with the weight of expectation. Jean-Claude Van Damme took the microphone. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to raise his voice. The ballroom had become the kind of quiet that only comes when 5,000 people have simultaneously ceased making sound. He spoke with a slight Belgian accent, a detail that somehow made what he said more consequential, as if the words arrived from a place farther away and therefore deserved more consideration. He said what he said in a manner that suggested he had been thinking about saying it perhaps for years, and now the moment had arrived to say it aloud in front of 5,000 people and one silent man in the fourth row who was wearing a denim jacket and a cap pulled low. He said, "I would challenge Chuck Norris if he were here, because you won't last one round with me. Not one round." The silence that followed was different still. It contained knowledge. Specifically, it contained the knowledge that an irreversible threshold had been crossed. Chuck Norris stood from his chair in the fourth row. He did not hurry. He did not make the standing itself into a performance. He simply moved from a seated position to a standing position in the manner that people stand when they have decided to stand. The rows between him and the stage contained other people, and these people turned to see who was standing. The recognition began in the fifth row and moved forward like a current moving across water. Row by row, the audience identified him. The specific current of recognition that spreads when a legend enters a room, even when that legend is simply standing. He walked toward the stage. 8 people stood to make a path for him. He did not acknowledge them. The world was indifferent. A waiter on the far side of the ballroom continued to distribute champagne to the back tables. A security guard adjusted his earpiece. A clock on the wall behind the stage advanced 1 minute. Chuck Norris reached the stairs that led up to the platform. He climbed them slowly. The specific pace of a man who has decided that haste belongs to younger people and people with things to prove. He stepped onto the stage. He looked at Jean-Claude Van Damme. He looked at the master of ceremonies. The master of ceremonies extended the microphone to him. He did not take it. Instead, he removed his denim jacket slowly, folded it once along the spine, and set it down on the edge of the stage. The audience understood that this was significant. An old man removing his jacket is different from an old man who simply moves. This folding, this deliberateness, he had already lost. He just does not know it yet. This was the signature line that filled the ballroom, not spoken but understood. 5,000 people who had come to watch Jean-Claude Van Damme demonstrate flexibility now understood they were about to witness something else. He stood still for 4 seconds. Jean-Claude Van Damme stood still for 4 seconds as well. They were 20 feet apart. The stage beneath them was 8 inches above the ballroom floor. The temperature had risen to 69 degrees. A man in the third row had set down his champagne flute on the armrest between 2 seats. A tournament referee, invited to authenticate the moment, had both hands flat against the table in front of him, a posture suggesting he was restraining himself from rising. The master of ceremonies held the microphone with both hands now, as if without both hands it might escape. The specific moment before violence occurs is not violence itself, it is the clarity that violence is about to occur. It is the knowledge that the world is about to acknowledge a shift in hierarchy through the medium of bodies and physics. The first movement came from Jean-Claude Van Damme. This was not a mistake. This was a choice. A man who has been told he will not last 1 round often chooses to end the speculation through initiation. He advanced 2 steps and threw a kick. It was a front kick. It was aimed at Chuck Norris's chest. It was technically perfect. The specific precision of a kick that has been practiced 10,000 times. Chuck Norris did not block it. He did not parry it. He slipped it. The movement was small. His body moved to the side by the width of a hand. The kick passed through the space where his chest had been 1/10 of a second prior. Jean-Claude Van Damme's momentum carried him forward. This was expected. A moment in a fight is not measured in seconds as clocks measure them. A moment in a fight is measured in the distance between two bodies and the number of available responses. Second 1. Jean-Claude Van Damme had regained his balance after the first kick. His weight was centered. He threw a second kick. This one was a roundhouse kick, the kind that comes from the side and demands either blocking or movement. Chuck Norris moved backward. 3 steps. Deliberate, the kick passed in front of him. The specific sound of a leg moving through air at high velocity is distinctive. It is sharp. It is confident. It is the sound of a weapon. The tournament referee in the third row did not close his eyes. He kept them open. But his specific stillness suggested that his body was preparing to close his eyes whether his will wanted them to or not. Second 2. Jean-Claude Van Damme was now committed. The third kick came immediately after the second, without pause, without reset. This was strategy. This was the mathematical hope that 3 consecutive kicks thrown with full power would penetrate the defense of a 60-year-old man wearing street shoes. This third kick was a spinning back kick. It was the signature technique. It was the one he had perfected over 30 years of discipline. His body rotated. His leg extended. The ballroom held its collective breath. The cameras, of which there were 7, captured the moment. The security guard adjusted his earpiece again. The waiter stopped distributing champagne. The spinning back kick is the most powerful kick a human body can generate. Every muscle from the feet to the shoulders contributes. When it lands with the force of a man's entire commitment concentrated into the surface area of a heel. But here is the specific architecture of distance. A fight is not 2 men hitting each other. A fight is a negotiation about distance. Distance is the variable that contains all other variables. A man who understands distance can throw a kick at a man who does not, and that man will move, and the kick will miss, and the man who threw the kick will discover that he has committed his entire body to a movement that now exists behind him instead of ahead of him. Chuck Norris moved forward. 1 step. The spinning back kick rotated through the air behind him. The heel passed within 6 inches of his spine, close enough that he could feel the temperature change, close enough that the audience gasped collectively, close enough that Jean-Claude Van Damme realized, in the moment his body completed the rotation, that all 3 of his best techniques had failed in succession. The fourth movement was not a kick. Jean-Claude Van Damme understood that his distance had collapsed. He understood that kicks require room. He advanced with his hands raised. This was boxing. This was the older language. Chuck Norris was smaller than he was. Chuck Norris was 60 years old. The specific arithmetic of age and size suggests that punching is the corrective action. Jean-Claude Van Damme threw a straight right hand. It was aimed at Chuck Norris's face. It was not a tentative punch. It was the punch of a man who believed the moment had arrived when force was the only remaining language. Chuck Norris caught it. Not blocked. Caught. His left hand received the punch in his palm and absorbed the entire force of a younger man's commitment. His hand did not move backward. The physics of impact require mass and velocity. Chuck Norris's mass, distributed correctly, was heavier than the forward momentum of Jean-Claude Van Damme's arm. The punch had nowhere to go. It stopped. In the moment a punch stops, the man who threw it understands that he has failed. This understanding is not intellectual. It is cellular. It is the way a body learns it has reached the limit of what it can accomplish. Jean-Claude Van Damme's body received this information. His arm was held. His forward momentum was stopped. He was now inside the shorter man's reach, which is where every fighter learns to fear being. Chuck Norris drew back his fist. His right hand rose. The specific potential for violence exists in the moment before a strike lands. Every eye in the ballroom understood what was about to happen. The tournament referee in the third row raised his hand slightly, as if to intervene. The master of ceremonies moved forward. The security guard spoke into his earpiece. But Chuck Norris was no longer the man he appeared to be. Or rather, he was exactly the man he appeared to be. He was 60 years old. He was wearing street shoes. He had come to this ballroom by accident, invited by a friend. He was not here to prove anything. He had nothing to prove. He was here to refute a specific sentence delivered by a younger man who had confused flexibility with mastery. The right hand stopped 1 inch short of Jean-Claude Van Damme's temple. It stopped as if it had encountered an invisible wall. The punch ceased to exist as violence and became instead a lesson. A specific demonstration of what would have happened had the punch continued. The fist was so close that Jean-Claude Van Damme's face registered the displacement of air. He felt the heat of the strike that did not strike him. He understood, in that moment, that he was alive because of a mercy he had not earned. Chuck Norris held his fist there for 3 seconds. Then, he lowered it. He extended his right hand, open, in a gesture that belongs only to men who understand they have won, and chosen not to complete the victory. Jean-Claude Van Damme took the hand. He was shaking. Not from fear, but from the specific exhaustion that comes from understanding you have been measured and found to weigh less than you believed. They stood that way for 4 seconds. Chuck Norris moved his other hand to Jean-Claude Van Damme's shoulder. He leaned close. He spoke 7 words. They were audible to the tournament referee in the 3rd row and to perhaps 3 others among the 5,000. He said, "Skill without wisdom is a blade you cannot hold." Jean-Claude Van Damme's face changed, not in public but in that private moment between 2 men. His expression moved from shame to something else. Recognition. The specific recognition of a man receiving instruction from someone with the authority to deliver it. The choice in that moment belonged entirely to Jean-Claude Van Damme. He could apologize. This was one fork in the road. He could make an excuse. This was the other. He could say his foot was injured. He could say he had not been prepared. He could say the stage was slick. He could say anything that allowed him to walk away with narrative intact. Instead, he stepped back. He released his hand. He raised the microphone from the stage floor where the master of ceremonies had abandoned it. He spoke to 5,000 people. He said, "I was wrong. I have spent 3 years thinking I was great at one thing. And I learned tonight that I was thinking about greatness the wrong way." The audience was silent. Then they applauded. Not the applause of spectacle. The applause of witnessing something true. Chuck Norris walked off the stage. He did not collect his jacket. A security guard collected it for him and held it open as he passed. The guard touched his shoulder as he left, as if to confirm he was real. In the parking lot, his friend was waiting by his car. They drove through Las Vegas toward the highway. The traffic moved around them, indifferent. The night was 69 degrees. On the street in front of the Golden Nugget, Jean-Claude Van Damme was surrounded by journalists. He was telling them the same thing he had said on stage. He was telling them that he had learned something. He was telling them that the story of what happened was not a story about a young man losing to an old man. It was a story about pride being measured against reality, and reality winning, and a younger man choosing to acknowledge it. The story of what happened in that ballroom spread through the martial arts community like a current through water. Fighters who had trained in the decades before began to tell the story to fighters who had trained after. The account mutated as oral histories do. In one version, Chuck Norris had not moved. He had simply stood there and Jean-Claude Van Damme's kicks had failed to touch him, as if he had possessed some quality that deflected violence. In another version, the fight had lasted 3 minutes, not 3 seconds. In another version, Chuck Norris had broken Jean-Claude Van Damme's arm, and then healed it with some ancient technique. These versions were not true, but they contained a truth underneath them. They contained the specific truth that an old man had entered a room, and a younger man had confronted him, and the younger man had learned something that changed the trajectory of his life. Jean-Claude Van Damme did not speak publicly about the incident again. Not in interviews, not in documentaries, not in the memoir he published in 1998. But the absence of speaking became its own form of speaking. In 1987, he began incorporating a teaching moment into his films. He was no longer simply the fighter who won. He became the fighter who fought and understood something about what fighting meant. His career took a different shape after 1985. He aged differently. He carried himself with a different kind of authority. In 2003, he gave a single interview where he mentioned the incident. He said, "I met a man who knew something I did not. He taught it to me without words. That lesson has followed every choice I have made since that evening." He did not name Chuck Norris. He did not need to. The audience understood. In 2001, Chuck Norris published his autobiography. There was a chapter near the end dedicated to the years after he had stopped acting. In that chapter there was a passage about an evening in Las Vegas. He did not name Jean-Claude Van Damme. He simply described a young man who had confused excellence at one thing with excellence at wisdom. He wrote, "The true measure of a fighter is not the power of his kicks or the speed of his combinations. The true measure is whether he has learned to ask the right questions about himself." The book was read by young fighters. The passage was quoted in martial arts academies. A school in Texas printed it on a plaque and hung it on the wall of their training room. Students who never knew Jean-Claude Van Damme and Chuck Norris read the passage and understood that it was a gift. A public note that one man had sent to another across 30 years. The specific silence of an old man removing his jacket in front of 5,000 people is not a silence at all. It is the sound of something invisible passing between two bodies. It is the sound of a younger man understanding he has been measured by a master. It is the sound of the world indifferent to these private revelations while they remain private, and then witnessing them when they become public. A man learns humility in many ways. He learns it through failure, through pain, through the erosion of time. The clearest learning comes when he meets someone who understands failure so well that they can show him mercy instead of violence. This is the lesson that travels. This is the story that does not mutate. This is what remains when all the versions of all the tellings are cleared away. The evening Chuck Norris was challenged by Jean-Claude Van Damme in front of 5,000 people was the evening that Jean-Claude Van Damme learned something that changed the direction of his life. And the night became a story. And the story became history. And the history became a lesson, moving from dojo to dojo, from fighter to fighter, each repetition altering it slightly, each retelling containing less of the external violence and more of the internal truth. The specific architecture of pride is this: it must be confronted by something larger than itself to understand its own smallness. And when that confrontation comes from a man who chooses mercy instead of triumph, the lesson becomes unforgettable. Next week, we will talk about how Chuck Norris exposed Steven Seagal's real credentials in front of the international film community. A claim made before 700 people. A claim that changed the careers of both men. Stay subscribed.